economist. Before that, he has a very distinguished academic career, but not only, since he was in particular the chief economist and senior vice president of the World Bank. And he has been working a lot on inequality. Actually, he's a leading specialist of both the theoretical and the empirical aspect of inequality development, and with a particular emphasis on policies. And he has been advising a number of leading international agencies and governments. Tim Smeating is the Lear and Whiter Distinguished Professor of Public Affairs and Economics at the Lafayette School of Public Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He was the founding director of the Luxembourg Income Study between 1983 and 2006. And I must say that lots of people, including myself, have been using a lot the Luxembourg Income Study. So Tim, thanks a lot for this huge contribution to the field. He has been the director of the Institute for Research of Poverty at the University of Wisconsin, and is the 2017 John Kenneth Galbraith Fellow of the American Academy of Political and Social Sciences. So interestingly, he was also a member of a committee organized by the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. The goal of the committee was to build an agenda to reduce the number of children in poverty by half. And so he's a co-author of the report. And this is totally topical for today's discussion. And for last but by no means least, Mina Elikeno she had a dual career, both as an academic and as a civil servant. She's a senior specialist in the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Employment in Finland, but she's also an adjunct professor at the University of Turku, where she has been a full-time professor and a senior researcher. She has worked extensively on social policies in general, but in particular, and this is, of course, quite interesting for us today, she's an expert of the Finnish universal basic income experiment. And I guess we're going to talk a lot about this. So we have a dream team of panelists on the topic. And without further ado, I will give the floor to the first speaker, François Bourguignon. François, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pierre-André, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me to this panel, which is part of the new Utopias program. Well, I'm not sure that eradicating poverty is a new utopia. It has been around for quite some time. And as a matter of fact, I'm not sure it is a utopia. And in some restricted sense, we could say that a lot of progress has been made in eradicating poverty. If we take the definition that is being used by the United Nations and by the World Bank, defining poverty in the world as the proportion of people with an income or consumption expenditures below $1.9 per person a day, then the proportion has declined enormously over the last 30 years. And it is not to be excluded that we'll be left with only a few percentage points by 2030, which is the horizon of the Sustainable Development Goals. But at the same time, we are also convinced that even if we reach that point, then there will still be poverty in the world. And the reason for that is that this $1.9 a day is only one definition of poverty. And when thinking about policies about fighting poverty, it is important to take into account other possible definitions, which may be closer to what the public opinion may have of poverty. And this is what I would like to say to start this panel, to talk about various definitions of poverty. Okay, first we can make a distinction between the monetary definition of poverty, like this $1.9 a day, and other definition that will include non-monetary dimensions. But even if we stick to the monetary dimension, there are different ways of looking at poverty. One is indeed to have a poverty line which is defined in absolute terms, those terms being essentially how much is needed in one country at one point of time to survive. That is to live a life where all the basic needs will be satisfied. This is a definition that is being used in the US. And there is a poverty line which has been updated by inflation. It has not been updated very often. It is updated by inflation, but only that. I'm not sure I remember the last time it was completely updated, which is today around $12,000 a year or $13,000 a year, if I remember well. Now, interestingly enough, the European do not have this kind of definition. The European define the poverty line as 60% of the median standard of living in the national population. So it is a relative definition where surviving is defined in social terms. Surviving is having access to consumption which are not too far from what the median person in the population has access to. So this means that as the economy is growing, as people are getting richer in general, the poverty line is moving up. So you can see that under this condition, the economy can grow forever, but if the distribution of income does not change, then this means that there will always be some poor people in the population. And this is exactly what people feel when moving from one country to a much richer country, realizing that in the much richer country, there is always some poverty defined in relative terms. But then there are also non-monetary aspects. Monetary means that we are talking about all those goods and services which can be bought by money to survive. But what do we do with those goods which we cannot buy? What do we do with environment? What do we do with security? What do we do with access to healthcare? What do we do with access to good education? This cannot be bought simply because this is provided by the community, and people may be poor because of that. And this led to what is called the multidimensional definition of poverty, where besides the monetary aspect, which is material deprivation, some other types of deprivation are taken into account. For example, access to education of the children, or good education of the children, the access to healthcare, and possibly even the health status of people in the family, the degree of security, the fact that people can go to vacation or not. All these are deprivations which correspond to kind of vector which defines poverty. So one may be poor with respect to one dimension, not poor with respect to another. And then poverty would be defined as people whose number of deprivation in that list is above some minimum. This is used by the United Nations recently. And as a matter of fact, this is now the definition used by the European Union, which is not referring to poverty as such, but is referring to the risk of poverty and social exclusion. And in social exclusion, precisely, there are those deprivations with respect to collective good. So to have in mind those various dimensions is important because this means that we may be successful in fighting monetary poverty, but we may not be successful in fighting educational poverty. If this is the case, then this means that the anti-poverty strategies must be multi-pronged. At the same time, it is quite clear that there is a relationship between all those dimensions, and that better education in the future will correspond or will lead to less monetary poverty. So this means that anti-poverty are multidimensional, but with some relationship between those various dimensions, which makes anti-poverty policies a little more difficult to elaborate. But I would like to finish this quick tour d'horizon of the definition of poverty and therefore of anti-poverty policies with another one. It turns out that I have been associated with an NGO, which is an international NGO called ATD Fourth World. ATD stands for Tous agir pour la dignité, all acting for dignity. This association is working directly with poor people. And recently, I mean, a few years ago, they had in mind that they expressed the view that poor people were deeply unsatisfied with the way in which technocrats like me were defining poverty. And say, okay, what is this $1.9 a day or whatever, this $13,000 in the US? Even deprivation is not really the point. There are other dimensions, deep dimensions in poverty that must be taken into account if you really want to deal with it. And among those dimensions, I mean, they worked, I mean, there was working groups organized in various countries in the world. And I remember to have participated to one group in France, but also to one group in Tanzania, in one group in New York. Those groups were reflecting on, for those people, what was the definition of poverty and how should poverty, anti-poverty policy be addressing those other dimensions. And they insisted very much on a concept like shame, saying, okay, because we are ashamed, because we are poor, there are many things that we cannot do. We will not go to try to get a job simply because we feel uneasy, because we don't have the right clothes on us, and because we are ashamed, we cannot bargain or we cannot present ourselves in the best way. What should we do with the fact that we have the problem of security where we are living? And the fact that we are never completely sure about whether tomorrow we will have exactly the same goods that we have today. And their point is to say that as long as policies do not take into account this aspect, then they will be incomplete. They will be dealing with one part of poverty, but not with the other. If people are ashamed to go to that window to get their food stamps, then they will not go. Or if they go, they will not go to an appointment for a new job. And this must be certainly taken into account. So it is this very complex set of dimensions of poverty that must be taken into account when we think about policies. And I'm very happy to have in this panel Mina, who will be talking about the basic income experiment in Finland, because to some extent this experiment is addressing part of the issues that I just mentioned with this non-deprivation, non-monetary aspect of poverty. And I will stop here. You are mute, Pierre-André.
In principle, I'm unmuting using my space bar, but it doesn't seem to work. So thank you very much, Francois, and team, you're the next speaker.
Oh, thank you very much, Pierre-André, and thank you for the great introduction, Francois. I expected nothing less. As Francois pointed out, economic growth has led to a lot of absolute poverty reduction, no matter where you draw the line, particularly in Latin America and East Asia in the late 20th and the early 21st century. And that growth is important because people realize that their incomes were growing at 3, 4, 5% real terms every year. Their children were better off than they were. And it was a very bright time for the world, I think. But we can't just rely on economic growth alone to eradicate poverty and deprivation as we move forward. We need to think about other things. And I'm particularly interested in talking about things that drive or will be driving poverty and deprivation, instability and insecurity in daily life especially, and a few ways that we might be able to start to get around them, okay? And I'm particularly interested in children. I'm going to talk about children. We know from our National Academy of Sciences, for the first time, the United States admitted, all else equal, no matter where you live, what sort of family you are, race, ethnicity, or neighborhood, poverty has a negative causal impact on child development and on their future. Causal, that's important. For economists and others, it means, in other words, poverty does have big differences in the way the kids grow up and in their future. That's the first point. Now, children always face risks in the face of growing inequality and barely existent safety nets in a lot of countries. First of all, the most uninsurable risk, children cannot choose their parents. I wrote a book with Lee Rainwater, and we often would ask, what country would you, if you were facing the Rawlsian veil of ignorance, what country would you choose? If you were really risky, you might go to the United States, but if you were less risky and you were risk averse and you wanted to make sure your kid did a little bit better, you might go to somewhere in Northern or Central Europe where there was a somewhat less inequality, okay? So that's one. And the second thing is that rich parents self-insure their children and grandchildren. That's the way it is. Parents care for their kids. They do everything they can to give them some advantage. And they are, the more unequal the society, the less you find in terms of the public goods that are shared by all. So those are the older risks. But now we have new risks, which compound this disadvantage and create further instability and insecurity. And there's two of them that I'm particularly interested in. First of all, pandemics and disease, COVID. Hopefully this is a once in a century experiment. We had it once in the 20th century, disrupted life all over. We're just starting to learn the effects that it's had on children and child development and education, on insecurity, and on the stress that the parents faced. And we realized that, again, the least secure and the poor, those at the bottom of the pile, were the ones who probably have suffered most. Their children have less access to learning, and now we're going to have to recover. This is on the agenda of every major international organization that I know. The second thing, of course, and Francois alluded to this a bit, is the growing distributional effects of climate change. Weather, crops, homes, either due to flooding or fires or drought or both. People can't support their families in the ways they used to or stay in their homes because of rising sea levels and so forth, okay? Yes, we should do our best to try and reduce those hazards, but we're on the path. They're there. You don't have to go beyond the United States to see floods and fires anymore. The Australians have had a terrible time with it. This is a problem for all of us, okay? And so the last thing I would say is this. I just noticed something as I was preparing for this talk. There's something called an LHH survey that was done last week in France, the UK, and the US. And it finds that more than half of 18 to 24-year-olds surveyed were anxious about change, okay? Least likely to feel included, to believe in themselves, to be optimistic, and to feel in control of the next steps in life. So in other words, lack of control, insecurity, instability, those aren't good. Those aren't good for families or kids. So we need to create more of those. And so I have 4 or 5 things that we could do better at that I think we should start trying to do better at. These won't cure the problems of the world at all, but they'll provide some sort of a minimum floor. And I think that's really important, and in a way that doesn't have shame or finger pointing or stigma and things like that that Francois was talking about. First of all, without a doubt, we need better and more stable world food aid and distribution. We've needed that for years. The World Food Organization's come close, but when you have malnutrition, stunting, and wasting in children, we don't need that. We should be able to feed the world's children. Food should be the first priority. Then we need more coordinated approaches to public health, infectious disease control, and pandemics, including globally available vaccines and preventive measures, but working on things like malaria eradication and ringworm eradication in Africa. These diseases are pernicious. They reduce human potential and human ability to grow, to learn, to go to school, and so forth. Third, and I'm coming close, Mina, are guaranteed income for children called child allowances, okay? Why? Children are expensive, and there are social spillovers to seeing them not be poor, as I just mentioned, and to grow up in a safe and productive way. We've had some conditional cash transfers before, but I would prefer just basic allowances in a universal fashion, which can be taxed back or faded out as incomes rise well above the median. We've even had some success, limited and fleeting progress here in the USA. We had a child allowance for a year last year, and now it's in jeopardy, but we hope it continues. It's the number one thing that will reduce poverty and insecurity and lead to better child outcomes, at least in America, and I believe in a lot of the rest of the world. And even small child allowances in South Africa and Brazil have been shown to produce better outcomes. We also obviously need a coordinated international plan to help refugees, including especially climate migrants. Yes, we have Ukrainians now who are being driven from their homes, and before them Syrians, and before them some African populations. But now it's going to be bigger and more widespread. Climate change is not going to allow people who live in the high plains in Latin America to grow their own food anymore. Rising sea levels are going to push people away from the shores all around the world, the ocean shores, and they need to be able to have some way to move to a situation where they can work hard and save their families. And finally, I would say the last point is inclusive economic growth, coupled with human capital development. Schooling is particularly important in a lot of places in the world, particularly for women who are excluded in a lot of countries. But the World Bank and the UN's focus on the bottom 40% on their share of the pie and on their growth is particularly important in this respect. And there are policies that do this, okay? Even in the face of a world where the capital is overtaking labor, the growth dividend from that capital could be better shared. And so I'm just going to leave you with that, a few ideas of things we could do, how we're going to get them done. We could talk about that. But I, too, want to hear from Mina about the Finnish experiment with a basic income. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. Mina, everybody's dying to hear you, so you have the floor.
Thank you, Pierre, for introducing me, and thank you, Francois and Tim, for very interesting presentations. I'm trying to put you into the map about the Finnish UBI experiment, which took place in years 17 and 18, already a couple of years ago, but which we are still evaluating. I think Tim brought up a very interesting concept of human potential. In Finland, I think we can take the next slide. If we talk about Finland, I don't know how well you know the Finnish social security system. Finland is one of the Nordic countries with a very extensive social security system covering hundreds of benefits and free or affordable services. And I would say that the services, the free services, healthcare, social services, and education, also university education, are the basis of the Nordic welfare state. And I just wanted to take here a section 19 from our constitution, which I think describes well how we think about our welfare state. We are obliged to maintain or give necessary means to survive in our community in Finland. Some kind of minimum income is a subjective right. So everybody who is resident in Finland, who is living in Finland, is entitled to last resort minimum income social assistance. And I think this is the basis where this has to be understood when talking about the Finnish basic income experiment. We are not trying to eradicate poverty. Actually, what we wanted to see was whether with basic income we can increase employment. You probably read about Finnish UBI experiment being an employment experiment. Was it an actual UBI experiment or something else? I would say that it was a basic income experiment when thinking of all the kind of definitions for basic income. We experienced our kind of basic income, and it was a basic income experiment. But as regards our constitution, it gives us solid ground for kind of not having poverty, so that we shouldn't be or shouldn't have to eradicate poverty, not even think about that. But of course, this utopia that was invented in Sweden, the Nordic welfare state in 30s, 40s, and which we have then copied in Finland, we haven't still achieved it. We have families struggling with income. We have families struggling with not having the future. They can't see the future. They can't fulfill their dreams. They barely survive to the next day. They don't know where to get enough food for the next day. They don't have the warm meal in the table. So we have families like that. It's not because they wouldn't get enough money, but because there are so many costs in their lives. And perhaps also our social security system is quite complex. You don't always understand to what you're entitled to and to what. And this was not the main motivation for the Finnish experiment to simplify the system, but this is what we talk all the time in Finland, and we have actually an ongoing reform, 8-year-long reform on social security system, where we want to make it more simple, at the same time motivate people to accept work and to kind of build their human potential. Next slide, please. So what we experimented for 2 years was a certain kind of basic income. We didn't pay these 2,000 people who were randomly selected to the experiment. We didn't pay them more than they would have gotten when being unemployed. These 2,000 people were at the point when they were selected to the experiment, they were unemployed, receiving unemployment benefits from the Social Security Institution of Finland. And they got the same amount of money in the basic income experiment than they would have gotten anyway. So we didn't kind of pay anything. We didn't pay suddenly almost 600 euros more than normally, but the same amount. But the difference was that we paid it unconditionally. They didn't have to think whether they have filled some criteria, which is too difficult to understand. What should I do today in order to fill the criteria, in order to get the money? Do I get this 560 euros next month or something else due to some criteria I don't understand? If I'm too tired, if I'm too sick to go to the PES office, if I forget to register myself as an unemployed job seeker, if I don't do that or that or that, and I don't get the money, how do I survive? How do I buy the food for the children? So this unconditionality was the main thing in our experiment, to see whether it takes some kind of burden away from people so that they are empowered to search for work. Next slide, please. What we found was not significant employment effects. I think that this is, and Verho and others, they have written a really excellent paper, which is published in American, I think it was American Journal of Economics, about the results. And because we selected mostly long-term unemployed people to the experiment, I think we didn't even expect to see significant changes between the treatment and control group. There was a slight difference, but not a huge one. And I think, and also most of those who were kind of, because they didn't have to participate in the system. They didn't have to they didn't have to register themselves as unemployed job seekers. They didn't have to take part in services. But actually what we found was that they did, even if they didn't have to. They wanted to get the services. They are very used to, in Finland, you actually like the services you get for free. So, and we trust that we get good services. So they wanted to get the services in order to enhance their employment possibilities. They didn't want to stay at home and wait something to happen because they didn't believe anything would happen. They've been unemployed for a long time. So there's several reasons why we don't see, or we didn't see any employment effects. Probably if we've experimented this basic income in another kind of group, we would have seen some effect. Next slide, please. What I did together with Alan Söder, Andrade and Professor Olli Kangas, we wanted to look at what the basic income, what kind of effects it had on trust and confidence, and what kind of bureaucracy feelings these people had who were in the experiment. And I think this is where we come to the very interesting results. There were significant differences when we make a survey, of course, a very low response rate, but anyway, we observed a significant difference in trust, in confidence, in trust in other people, in trust in institutions, in confidence in the future, which is really important in eradicating poverty, and eradicating the negative effects of poverty, is to have faith in yourself, in your future. And that's what basic income did in Finland for these long-term unemployed. And what was interesting is that we didn't actually found very strong correlation between trust in social institutions and bureaucracy feelings and basic income. So what it does to be a receiver of a very selective social benefits is that you lose trust in other people because you feel yourself kind of low in social status, but you didn't lose, even then you didn't lose your trust in institutions. So strong is the trust in Nordic welfare state in the institutions. It's really strong. I actually talked about this experiment for 28 students from Stanford University today, and they were really interested about the trust. And I also asked them whether they think that basic income could be a solution in the future. And I think 26 of them said yes. I don't know if the 2 of them were listening or not, but almost all of them said it yes. And they were young people who are the future for us. Next slide, please. So I'm ending here. It was a fine experiment. I wouldn't change today in evaluating it, but it was, after all, just a scientific employment experiment. And if you want to know more how basic income would affect, or some kind of unconditional minimum assistance for citizens or residents, if we want to know how it affects, we have to have more experiments in different parts of the world with different populations. But what I think it's really good in this experiment is that it was a randomized controlled trial, so we can actually say that what we saw, what we observe, is actually due to the experiment. So it was not that revolutionary that perhaps was somewhere reported, but it was in a way very unique and very interesting experiment. We may have seen more effects for different kind of group, and we may see different kind of effects if we actually remove the 100 benefits and take only one benefit instead. Now we just added one. And I would come to the very good opening speeches of Francois and Tim about the utopias and what should we ask, what should we aim at about the children, what kind of future we want to build for them. And one of my idols is Olof Palme, and I am always thinking what I would, if I want to plan a future society, what would Olof Palme say? What kind of future it should be? I think he was a very wise man. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mina. Before opening the floor for a general Q&A session, I will give some time to the panelists themselves to comment and discuss the other presentation. Let me just say before that if you're in the general audience and you have questions, given the large number of people in the audience, the simplest way is to use the Q&A box in the Zoom application, and then those during the discussion between panelists themselves, and then we will move to the questions that have been asked. So that said, the floor is back to the panelists, and let's keep the same order. So let François Bourguignon start the discussion.
Thank you very much, Pierre-André. Thank you very much, Mina, for this nice presentation. What I like is the fact that this is an opportunity of correcting misunderstandings about basic income, in particular with respect to the basic income experiment in Finland. I mean, in many instances, I heard that, oh, look at what they do in Finland. They are giving a basic income to people and that's it. So everybody has 560 euro to live with, no strings attached. Fantastic. Yes, I mean, it is true, but the reform is not, as you very well said, the reform is not changing the income that those people have to live with. It is only changing the way in which this income is being delivered. And this is something which is quite important, because if we think about basic income and we say, okay, let's start from scratch, there is no redistribution system, there is no Nordic welfare state, and therefore there are people who are really poor. We start with a basic income giving to everybody those 560 euros. Fine. But in that case, we have to finance that, which means that at the same time, we have to look at the taxes that we'll have to raise in order to finance that. And then we have the very simple model that was proposed 50 or maybe 60 years ago by Milton Friedman, called the negative income tax, saying, okay, you receive so much, and from the first dollar that you earn, you'll be paying 30% income tax on all what you earn, which means that if you don't earn very much, overall you'll be receiving money. And if you earn a lot, because you'll be paying more taxes than the lump sum that you receive, then you'll be paying. And this is a basic income in the simplest sense that one can imagine. Now, the point is that in Finland, in Germany, in France, this kind of system already exists in a very, as you said, very complicated sense. We have thousands, maybe not thousands, hundreds of benefits. We have hundreds of rules that determine whether one has the right to get that benefit or another, which means that the system is unreadable for people. And in France, we have a system which guarantees the minimum income to everybody. The point is that people are very surprised to see that from one quarter to another, they don't receive the same amount of money. Every quarter they have to make to report about what they did, what were their income, what was the kind of work, what kind of things they did in order to get a job if they don't have a job, etc., etc. And because of that, they don't feel that they have a basic income. They feel that they're receiving some subsidies in a sometimes haphazard way, but this is not really the basic income that people would have in mind. And what is really nice in the Finnish experiment is the fact that you move from such a system to a system where, yes, truly, without any kind of condition, you have this income that is given to people. And this does not change at all the budget constraints of the government. This is done at the same level of taxation. And there is no additional money that governments must give in order to have this basic income being implemented. And yet, you observe that this has an impact. It's an impact on the way people live, the trust that they have, as you have just said. This has an impact on their welfare, basic welfare. This does not change very much their behavior in terms of looking for jobs. And they live definitely a better life with that. Now, the point is that poverty is still there because 560 euros is not enough to get out of poverty. And one of the issues that we could ask is whether through this kind of system or through the existing complicated system that we have in other countries, whether it would be possible to increase the level of this minimum income guarantee that is being offered. So because of that, I really find that this experiment is quite interesting, but there is nevertheless a kind of confusion in the way in which many people read this experiment, thinking that this is something completely new, that those people didn't have this money before the experiment, which is wrong. And very often I had to get into strong debate with people to tell them this is the way in which it works, and to give them some references so that they can see exactly the way in which it works. But there are in several countries attempts at simplifying the system. They did it in the UK. The result apparently is not, simply putting together various benefits and simplifying the way in which those benefits would be distributed. In France, there is some talks about organizing something similar, and they call this putting together several benefits new universal benefit or something like that. Now, all this is not new. The point is that in those countries which are lucky enough to have developed this kind of system, the issue is to simplify the system, and the Finnish experiment is very instructive from that point of view. On the other hand, there are countries, especially in the US, where such a system does not exist. And from that point of view, yes, there is something else to be learned from this kind of country. And so here.
Thank you very much, François. Tim?
Well, I'm not amongst the more pro-safety Nordic or Central European or French welfare state. I come from a country where we target things too much. We make things too hard for people to get benefits. We give them big benefit reduction rates with their incomes rise, and then we work test and force and so forth. It's a system that just hasn't worked. But we don't have, it would cause some increase in taxation, redirection of public spending in a country like the United States, or as Canada is doing right now, to achieve some sort of a minimum income. Now, the place to start where the Canadians are starting and where the Americans are starting are for children, because the child allowance seems to have worked pretty well. And you're doing this in a country, in my country, where, as you know, we have the world's most expensive and least equitable healthcare system. It was the world leader in elementary and secondary education, but fell and still falling flat on its face in terms of subsidized childcare and early childhood education and so forth. So we tried this child allowance in our country, and people used the money to buy childcare so they could go to work. Isn't that terrible? They fed their families. They tried to improve their housing. They paid down their debts. Exactly what you expect them to do. But somehow this was too much for too many political types. And now it will rise again, I think, but it's temporarily on hold. So in a country which doesn't have strong labor protection, which doesn't have a family policy on leave, which does not have universal subsidized childcare, we have to build up to get to the world that you're at. We do recognize and have recognized, however, that too much administrative burden, too much pressure on people to sign up and do this and that is counterproductive and doesn't produce any good. So we can learn from your experiment that when things are simpler, it might build more trust. It might build certainly more security. There will always be something at the end of the month with their child allowance. Alone, it is not going to, move you to the middle class or whatever, but it's a floor. It's a platform, as some people call, below which, you won't fall. And that was an important idea for Americans to get. Many of us have got it. Many of us are pushing hard on it. And so I'm hoping for at least a basic minimum income for children in the United States as we move forward. And that would be a huge turnaround for my country. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Mina, a quick answer to Francois and Tim.
Yeah, I think it's all about trust. We saw that those people who received basic income, they had higher trust and they had more confidence in themselves. And I would say that this is kind of even more important if you have children. If you're alone or if you're just an adult household, I think it's not that bad to have sometimes difficult times. But if you can't support your children, if you can't give the food to the table for the children, and they lose trust to those who should help you. Finland, as a Nordic welfare state, had promised in its constitution that we take care of everybody who lives in Finland. And if it doesn't happen, it's so easy to break the trust. And I think what we saw in the basic income experiment, we didn't see negative employment effects. We didn't see positive, but we didn't either see negative employment effects. So people actually worked as much when they received the unconditional basic income. So, and on top of that, they had more trust, more confidence. They felt better as people, as parents. And I think that's really important when we now are doing a social security reform in Finland, to kind of ask the right questions. What's the utopia we are heading to? What kind of world we want to live in? And world, because I think it was a German chancellor in the beginning of 19th century that, or in 20th century, that we have to build a social security system to that extent where people move, and we are moving in the European Union quite freely and in the world quite freely. So that's actually one thing in basic income that I rarely come to discuss is, could we actually implement it only in Finland? Should we have some kind of international discussion about basic income? Because I would say that in the European Union, it would be impossible. That's my opinion. But there are wiser people than me that regard. But thank you very much for the comments.
Thank you very much. So now the floor is open for the general Q&A. As a moderator, I will use my privilege as a moderator to start with a question, which is, I'm not familiar with the Finnish experiment. Did you collect data on consumption? And if so, what was the impact in terms of consumption? Because, essentially you're reducing a lot the uncertainty. You're telling those people you're going to receive this money no matter what. Don't worry about not filling out the right form or whatever. In terms of consumption behavior, in particular, I don't know, expenditures on children or on food or whatever, did you find something?
Unfortunately not. We didn't collect data on consumption, and we didn't ask that in our survey. But I'm pretty sure I was not collecting the qualitative interview data. It was done in the University of Helsinki, but I think they may have asked about the kind of security, what the basic income brought with it, that you can actually plan what to eat next day, that you know that in every case, whatever happens, you will get the money next month, and you can buy not very much with 560 euros. On top of that, you may get social assistance and housing allowance and child allowance, and we have many different benefits. But no, we didn't, on consumption itself, we didn't collect data. No, that's too bad.
Thank you very much. So the floor is open for general questions, and I have a first question from the audience, which the question is the following. Do you think that the implication and the benefits of such a system are similar between developed and developing countries? And if not, as one would expect, what should be done to tweak the system, to adapt the system to developing context, to the context of developing countries? Who takes the question? Maybe François. Yes, yeah. You know a lot about developing countries, right? Yeah.
Yes, I mean, okay, it depends on which developing country we are talking about. Because if we want to have something that resembles a basic income, that is, which is guaranteeing a minimum income to everybody, we must be able to finance such a basic income. And raising the money is not that easy in low-income countries. So there are some of them with a system which is kind of the beginning of something like that. Ethiopia is a country like that, where there is a kind of universal conditional cash transfer program, which is in a very low-income country. But now if we look at emerging countries, then they have this kind of income guarantee. The first one was Mexico, which created in the late 90s the Progresa program, which was a conditional cash transfer program addressed to poor people, and which was making a cash transfer, reducing, of course, the degree of poverty of the family, conditional only on the fact that children go to school and would go to see a doctor at least once a year. This program was extremely successful. Then it expanded over time, and it turns out that recently it was abolished by President Obrador, who considered that there was some corruption, or because the program was not well used. And the reason for that is interesting. It's the fact that to determine whether a household has a right to this cash transfer is based on some criteria. It is not an income criteria. Why? Simply because it is very difficult to measure or to monitor the income of those people. I mean, think about a farmer. How do you monitor the income of a farmer throughout the year? So the farmer had some criteria in terms of the dwelling that they had, in terms of the number of acres of land that they were cultivating, in terms of the size of the family, etc. But there is no exit condition, which is well specified, which meant that there were more and more people in the program. And the program was more and more expensive. And because of that, at some stage, the government said, no, I mean, there is no way. Now we see that there are people who are receiving the transfer and who are not really poor, simply because it was, over time, very difficult to do the right selection of people who would be eligible to the program truly, and people who are not anymore eligible. And this is the main issue that we find in most of those countries, because for the moment, the idea of having something truly universal is cannot be considered, simply because the cost of such a measure would be enormous. But the notion of cash transfer is quite important. In Brazil, in Colombia, in Chile, at the time of the COVID, there was huge transfers made to the population. This practically didn't raise any kind of problem. So the technology is there. The problem is to monitor the eligibility of people to this kind of transfer.
You can one more example, and it's a lot of people have shown, for instance, in Brazil, they even had a very small widow's pension that they gave universally to widows. And it turns out what this did is the grandmothers bribed their grandchildren to go to school. In other words, they said, you can't get on the streets and beg and whatever, you need to go to school, and I'm going to give you this as a reward. Now that was a big intergenerational transfer, and it was small, and there's something similar Angus Steaton was telling me about in South Africa too. I don't know all the details there, but a small grant, which is all they could afford, has some fairly big effects. So the question is, how do you need to build the economic base or have a more progressive tax system so that you can afford this? And in the long term, I think that's possible.
Thank you. Among the questions from the audience, there was a comment by Mina that attracted a lot of attention, this notion that the Finnish system could not be implemented in the European Union. And of course, people are asking, why do you think it would be impossible? Not surprisingly, right?
I was probably not clear enough, sorry. What I meant is that I think it's not possible for one nation, one member state in the European Union to implement basic income, because even if it's stated in the European Union that the union itself, it does not want to kind of hassle with the social policies, that all the member states can take control of their social policies themselves, but actually it has a quite strict regulation. Probably most of you know that according to the treaties or the Social Security Act is that you have to have a very good justification on your member state if you want to pay or not to have a portable Social Security benefit. And I would say that if we'd pay basic income in Finland unconditionally, and we wouldn't expect them to be in the use of the national labor markets, then we don't have any justification for not to take the receivers of basic income could take the basic income and live in Italy, for example. So I think that's why we need a European Union-wide discussion about the social policies. We are not in the stage to discuss basic income. We can discuss basic income, but what we first need to discuss is where we were perhaps in 60s or 70s, that kind of one social policy, one social European Union. And that was, for some reason, we went to a kind of different direction in the 70s, 80s, 90s. And we are perhaps this kind of debates about basic income is a little bit kind of step to that direction again, that we're talking in European Union about togetherness. And I think now the situation in the Eastern Europe will kind of bring us more close to each other. But yeah, the developing countries, I think the bottom line is that I really like the idea of the human potential. It's just different in different countries. If kids can't go to school because they have to beg for money, what you get when you know that you have certainty, income is secured, you think, okay, perhaps now I can make plans. I will take the kids, I can make them to go to school because I know that the money comes also next month. They don't have to beg next month and not the next month. So I think the basic line is the same, that you can trust that you are taken care of, independent, kind of regardless of where the basic income is implemented. But of course, what you do with the money differs. Thank you.
Thank you. There are many questions, so I'm not sure I will be able to ask all of them, but a question maybe for Tim. You were talking about universal basic income for children. An alternative, or maybe a complement, I don't know, are the kind of policies that are delivering in-kind services to children, in particular to very young children. Apparently, so there's been a lot of discussion among economists. It was decided that a lot of things happen during the 5-6 years of life, and it's very important to help those children. And money, in a sense, is not essential. What's essential is care, cognitive development, and things like this. What's your take on this?
Well, that's absolutely right. There's an experiment now going on called Baby's First Year, and other experiments, that children are very vulnerable and their brain development depends on stability and security, as well as meeting some minimal standard of living. So if the parents are less worried or less concerned about whether they have to pay the rent, if food is available also, or even if it's not, with this child allowance, you can use the money to do what you think you need. Everyone needs a little bit of cash at some point, whether you for something. So you can't just do it by saying, here's a food stamp or a housing voucher and so forth. And all of those are very targeted too. So the child allowance just allows you to decide what you need to do for your children. And people are making good choices. The money is not going up in drinking and smoking and everything else like that. In fact, there's some experiments that Hiro Yoshikawa at NYU has, that they do less of that. The money's dedicated to the children and helping them. And early on is really important because you can afford, for instance, in the United States, we have a lot of shift work. A lot of people are working 3 to 11 and have strange hours that change all the time. Well, that pays a little bit more than the day shift. But if you take the day shift, then you can spend more time in the evening with your kid, with your child than before. And if you have some sort of a family leave policy that gives you time with your children, particularly early on, that's very, very important. And early childhood education is part of that too. So even in the United States, there's good evidence and there's a strong press that if your child is under 6, you got a bigger child allowance, or you got a bigger basic income for kids. That's in the US law now because you needed it more and because it was more crucial at that stage for the child's development. So I'm a total believer in that.
Thank you. Do the other panelists want to comment on this? Okay. If not, there are two more, and I think final question, but they're in some sense related. It's about international aspects of the fight against poverty, and in particular, this notion of universal basic income. One question is, if we want to do that at an international level, there should be some redistribution, not only within country, but also across country. The idea being that the wealthy country should contribute to some extent to whichever program are created in the poorer country. country. And the second question, which is, I think, directly related, which is maybe one way, that's a question, maybe one way to do that would be debt cancellation. And I know that the World Bank in particular has been thinking very hard and about those issues about debt cancellation. So what is your take on these questions?
If I may, first, I mean, the international basic income, the issue is exactly the issue that Mina was mentioning about Europe. It is the same thing. I mean, we cannot imagine the basic income at the European level. We may imagine a system similar to the Finnish system in many countries, possibly in all countries, but the level of the basic income will not be the same. So which means that this is a principle of subsidiarity of the European Union. Every country has some freedom in the way it organizes its redistribution. And they may have the same instruments, but the instruments may not be the same. Now, of course, we will have exactly the same problem if we were to do that at the international level. Now, if we look at the issue of the debt cancellation, the big issue here is canceling the debt will be, if we want to replace, to introduce the basic income, we should require from those countries who will not pay the debt to pay a basic income, okay? Which means that the liquidity problem remains the same. We have countries which are not able to repay the debt. And if we are telling them, don't repay the debt, but have a basic income, and you have to raise the money to pay for it, then the problem is more or less the same, except for one thing, that the basic income will be paid in local currency, whereas the debt has to be reimbursed in dollars, which is a completely different game. But this is the reason why we cannot hardly go through the debt cancellation to impose something like a basic income.
That's a very interesting idea. If you can't pay your debt, take the money that you should have paid the debt and do something good with it. My gosh. Sounds good to me if you can make it work.
Well, yeah.
But I mean, we try to do it. I mean, there was this big debt write-off of the early 2000s, where it was asked to those countries which saw their debt being written off to spend more on some areas like education, like health, etc. But it didn't work. And didn't work because money is fungible. And when you spend a dollar or a peso on something, it is very difficult to say, this peso is coming from the money which I didn't have to spend on the debt. And it is not coming from somewhere else. It is very, very difficult to implement.
Nina, a reaction to that?
Yeah, the debt question is way beyond my expertise. I think I should not perhaps say anything about that, but I think Tim mentioned the wheel of ignorance, which I always try to mention to my students whenever I give a lecture. I try to make them think, what if they were born again randomly in any part of the world? What kind of lives they want to live, and based on that, they should, because they are the future experts on social policies in Finland, for example, they have to be able to imagine how it would be to be in somebody else's shoes. But I think the problem is, and there was some comments about how we see, for example, homeless people or poor people. I think in the end, we are humans, and we have our faults, and quite often I end up thinking about this Orwellian societies where we, for some reason, need to have the kind of compare ourselves to somebody else. And I know it's a difficult question. We want to have these utopias, and in the end, we are only kind of quite greedy people trying to make the most out of scarce resources. And do we actually want that those who are now live in absolute poverty, do we really want that they have a better life? Would we have done more if we'd wanted? I don't know. These are really, really difficult questions. And in the end, we've seen what it means that the nations have sovereignty. They can decide for themselves whether they take debts, whether they pay them in the end. Difficult questions, but really good ones. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What you just said about what you teach to your students reminds me of John Rawls' principle of the veil of ignorance. That when you make judgment about what society should be, you should always put yourself, if only intellectually, behind the veil of ignorance. You should put yourself in a situation in which you don't know exactly which position you will have in this society, because that's the only way to make fair judgment about what society should be. We are reaching the end of this discussion. I want to thank very much the panelists for a bit more than an hour that had been extremely dense, extremely enriching for basically everybody. Definitely it was for me. Thank you again. And I think that there is a lot to learn about the Finnish experiment. And I think about experiment in general. There is one thing that we learned in economics over the recent years is that the best way to understand what's working is let's try, let's do an experiment, and let's see the outcome. Thank you very much to everyone. And we see you. The next meeting will be about still another new utopia. Thank you.